Yep.
Well, speaking of bands that are absolutely massive, or artists, I should say, in this case, a band that's absolutely massive in the 80s that somehow just don't get talked about really anymore in the popular
Yep.
consciousness, we are finally at what I think there's a very good argument to make is probably the biggest band of the 80s, would you say? U2?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in
I
terms
think
of
so, yeah.
stadium sales and just popularity,
Record
and
sales in general, and
Yep.
just, yeah. And they kind of
mass
come in at,
appeal in a way.
well, and they come in, I think, at the exact beginning of the decade, right? 1980. So they are birthed in the 80s, and they exit the 80s, I think. Well, let's see. Let's see if I could do the run off top of my head, right? You got Boy, I believe, is their first one, and then October. You got War.
Which is the album we're covering now.
Is the War we covered? An Unforgettable Fire, right? I think is next.
No, there's one called Under a Blood Red Sky.
Under a Blood Red Sky. Okay, gotcha. And then Unforgettable Fire.
Yep.
And then Joshua Tree.
Yep.
And I believe that's it, because I think Achtung Baby's 90s, right?
Rattle and Hum is 88.
Well, that's like a concert doc.
Oh, is it?
kinda, So
Okay.
it's not really
Got it.
the same.
Then
and like
yes, you
Under a
would be
Blood
right.
Red Sky is also not like.
Oh, is it a live
proper
album or something?
Yeah, I think it's So it's, I don't know if that's proper.
Oh, it's
so
an EP. Interesting.
an EP. Yeah, there you go. So
Got it.
So yeah, that's the run. We'll cover War, we'll cover The Unforgettable Fire, and we'll cover Joshua Tree, I think, in this decade. So we're gonna go on the run of what's left. So yeah, like we're getting U2 right now, and I'll let you run the numbers in a second, but we're getting U2 kind of as they're becoming a huge band. I think famously Joshua Trees, when they hit like the complete megastardom, right? But they're
Yeah.
gradually building to megastardom here, and there's this album starts with two massive songs that we'll talk about in a second. But before we go down that rabbit hole, Josh, you want to run the numbers for us?
Yep. War by U2, released in 1983. It is the fifth highest rated album of 1983, according to besteveralbums.com. It is the 43rd best album of the 80s. It is U2's third best album of their 33 albums, according to besteveralbums.com. With the
Really?
with the first two being Joshua Tree and Achtung Baby, and Unforgettable Fire right behind it.
Okay.
And then U2 is considered the 24th highest ranked artist of overall artist rankings on besteveralbums.com. So that's pretty high up.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I know I said earlier we'll do first. Do you mind if I take the first take on this one? Because just to kind of throw some stuff out there, because I've been talking for a while about like finding the U2 episode to be very interesting. But I think one thing that I want to start with is this is their third album, but like Bono's like basically like 23 still at this point. So they're like a really young band still. You know what I mean? It's kind of crazy how young they are as artists.
When you hear this album, you would not know that, I would say.
Right, yeah, because they're pretty tight on this album.
Yes.
And now, how familiar are you with the earlier albums, Josh? Like the earlier U2 albums, For This Boy and October?
No, not familiar. In fact, this is my first time listening to this album.
Really? So you've never listened to? Oh, well then we got to start with you, because I know this album pretty damn well. Let's reverse it then. What were your thoughts?
I loved it. It was shockingly good. I was really surprised. I think U2's story arc over the years has kind of, risen
I was going to say,
and
why is
fallen.
it shocking to you? That's really a testament to like what I'm talking about with U2's hard fall, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
no, for sure. I think, you get later on, late 90s and then early 2000s, you kind of
the
hear,
Apple thing didn't help them.
Yes,
getting
that,
loaded onto iPhones, yeah.
And even before that, though, the albums, I think they just were not as well regarded as some of their earlier stuff, and their sound kind of became, I don't know, more stadium oriented and bigger and maybe electronic focused a little bit.
But some pretty stadium-oriented songs on this album, in my opinion, yeah.
I think it's so shocking to me because I only really know their big singles, and I've never listened to their album before. And this album, top to bottom, is really solid. I was shocked at how tight they are as a band on this album. That stuck out right away. The music is just it just sounds good from a technical perspective. It's really well produced. That was noticeable right away. Bono has such like a power and emotion in his voice. Edge's guitar is like really great. And then the other big thing was their drummer is super good on this album.
Adam Clayton.
Yeah. And that was something I never really paid attention to or noticed about U2 before. I really like the structure.
Or, I'm sorry. I said Adam Clayton. He's
Adam?
the bassist. It's Larry Mullen Jr. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I went quickly. So let me reverse that. Larry Mullen Jr.
Yep. And then I just kind of, the songs are all really well constructed together. They have interesting ways of intertwining the drums and the guitars. They incorporate these little things in the percussion, not just like regular drums, but also like I don't know, like cowbell or some sort of like sound like that in the background. They have they change tempos throughout the songs really well, and they just have really good beats overall, I think. Another interesting, like on a song like Red Light, they incorporate horns really effectively. They kind of dabble these things throughout, and they're not overused or gimmicky. They're just really integral or natural in the structure of the songs. And, the two big hits on here are Sunday Bloody Sunday, which is the opening track, and New Year's Day, which is the third track. I think those are probably the two biggest songs for sure.
The two most well-known songs for sure.
On here, they were they weren't they were pretty close. New Year's Day was the first single, it looks like, according to Wikipedia, and Sunday Bloody Sunday was the second, along with Two Hearts Beat Is One.
Two Hearts Beat Is One, which I was going to say is another pretty well-known song, especially amongst U2 fans.
Yeah, but even that song is one that I wasn't too familiar with. So
really, okay,
I have really probably a surface level knowledge of U2's.
So is U2 kind of like how you described REM for you?
Yes, exactly. That was the comparison I was thinking of. I was like, wow, they are just really surprisingly good to me in a way that I didn't expect. I think I know Joshua Tree probably because that's always earmarked as their quote unquote best album or most well known, and I think that has the most familiar songs to a lot of people on it. But yeah, and I'll be interested to revisit that for comparison purposes. But I was really struck by how much I like this right out of the gate.
Well, I think a couple things to talk about before I kind of get into mine that kind of go into things that might explain some things, Josh. In terms of some bio right here, you mentioned the drums. They actually had Larry Mullen Jr. played the drums to a click track to keep time on this album. He'd never done that before, and so that was pretty famously. U2 had gotten a lot of buzz for Boy. It was a pretty well regarded album, if kind of considered a little bit incomplete. The big song off that is I Will Follow, which is a pretty big song. They released October, an album I do like, but that they felt like, in true U2 form, like all of them were having like spiritual crises, because you can't talk U2 and not talk like like spirituality, because like it's in all of their lyrics. It's like pretty notably a common through line. There's songs that seem to be about something else, and then later Bono and different people are kind of saying, Bono especially, it's like, this was about me and God, you know what I mean, or my relationship. It's like, well, wait a second, I thought it was about like Northern Ireland. It's like, well, it was, but it's really also about to some degree, like, so there's like always and that's not negative, it's just sort of it's a central theme to them, to the fact that almost at times, like lyrically, U2 can come across like a Christian band at times. And Bono's not the only one, by the way. The Edge and Mullen also, I think even before this, they were like in this charismatic Christian group in Dublin.
Interesting.
And kind of, and they kind of like, they always kind of question like wanting to be the central themes of U2, right, or that spirituality, right, as well as like we want to be the biggest freaking rock band in the world, which like all of them I think agreed on from like day one. And Bono sort of represents, like manifests as the persona of it, but I think it was something that all of them bought into. Like we want to be huge, and then later like we want to be more than a band, which of course ended up, I think, hurting them as much as helping them. Like it helped them until it didn't anymore, and then it hurt them, you know, when the tide turned. But in 80s U2, and this album is still like the raw going for it U2, optimistic, energetic, passionate, right? I am familiar with U2, and I will often say like 80s U2 is a phenomenal band. Like their albums are all good. As you mentioned, they're tight. The Edge's guitar, I love like his guitar tone. I always have. There's like a ringing nature to his guitar. It's not jangly, but it does some of the same things that jangle guitar does. But I just have always loved how it sort of weaves in and out of, you know, Bono's urgent, sort of desperate voice, which is on display right here.
Yes.
As you mentioned, and this out, I actually think Adam Clayton is a really good basis in the context of what U2 does too, because you can't really have a bassist that runs to the front when you're competing against that guitar and you're competing against, you know, Bono's voice and charisma. So I always felt like his bass works well. And the drum beats in this poke through kind of like Edge's guitar. You know, like weaving in and out of, you know, Bono's voice in the production. And the production is Steve Lillywhite.
Oh, okay.
Who we've talked about before. And he notably did all of U2's first 3 albums. And he had a rule that he never worked with an artist more than twice, but he broke it for U2 for this album, for War. So, yeah. And, you know, before this, I think they didn't think, they kind of had a crisis of confidence too. They weren't so sure they were going to hit it big and stuff like that. They kind of had some shows they didn't love. And this is where they sort of doubled down with the idea of like, we're going to do a great next album. And they did. And, you know, the album kind of, it was reviewed better than U2. I think rock critics have always had a difficult relationship with some elements of U2 because there's an earnestness to U2 that rock critics tend to hate, right? And here's a good question for you too. Like, is U2 cool, right? Like, because we're thinking of them like in the era when they kind of got old and less cool, right? But like 80s U2 did have the like coolness, like they were mainstream and, you know, and there was a time when like Bono's humanitarianism and stuff was sort of looked at as, you know, making a modern rock star, right? And was not sort of like a meme, you know?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't view this album as too earnest in any sort of way. I think it does sound, I mean, just the quality of the music really is enough for me to I mean, at this point, were they even getting some of that kind of negative feedback on being earnest, or that their perception?
I mean, there were some critics that always felt they were a little too, you know, on the nose, right? And the lyrics, you know, it's like the lyrics are very straightforward. Bono uses a lot of like allegory, right? But his allegory's very easy to piece through at times. Like when it's not, it's kind of like you can always default to like it's about his mother or like, you know, God, right? And you're usually right most of the time. And you know, then there's stuff like, I think New Year's Day is about the solidarity movement. That's, you know, behind, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but yeah, Pope John Paul came out of that, and like Catholicism and stuff like that. So, and like nuclear proliferation, you know, is mentioned a couple of times, and that's the theme. So, but it's always sort of like in a biblical context, right? So I don't want to overdo that, but you know, that I think sometimes that's like, yeah. But another thing I want to mention is the fact that, that this album is pretty clearly designed to be played in big venues. It's like their stadium album. And like, you know, it right off the bat, there's like 2 stadium anthems. And I think maybe not having been as familiar with earlier U2, there aren't songs that pop quite like that. Like the big hits like Gloria and October and I Will Follow, right? They're big songs and they're singles, but they're not like stadium. It's kind of almost like the Who with Who's Next, right? Where it's like they're clearly writing these songs to play in front of, you know,
I mean, Sunday,
you know,
Monday Sunny has this epic feel to it right from the start of the song.
Yeah, that
big sound.
You know, the drum, the kicking drum beat into it. Yeah. So, but yeah, I'm glad that you felt that way, Josh, because I've always felt that as U2 kind of lost their luster as a big band, it became it crossed a Rubicon where like people would kind of like roll their eyes at some of the stuff and kind of say, oh, maybe they're not doing their best work. And kind of like U2 as a band kind of got disregarded.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest difference between them and REM is that even though REM kind of declined at the end, they didn't decline so precipitously that they had this other period, right, where they stuck around. They just kind of disappeared, you know, whereas U2 kind of didn't. They kept trying to make albums and be in the presence, and you know, they had some missteps, but I think because of that it became easy and lazy to kind of discount like what great work they were doing in the 80s, and they really were, because it's a really good album. And it's good from start to finish, by the way. There are not really weak tracks on this album.
No, I agree.
And the deep cuts, which I guess would be, for people that aren't familiar with U2, would be anything outside of the first, you know, 2 tracks on the album.
For sure.
I mean, there's
Refugee. I really liked.
Yep, Refugee is good. Any other tracks stand out to you? Because I've got a couple of my own that I love. But
that one and Two Hearts Beat is one. Those are the 2 other big standout ones for me.
Which kind of is like a single. Too, in some ways, but I've always been a pretty big fan of Surrender as well. It's a little bit longer, and it's
female singer in that one too.
There's a female singer in it as well. I apologize for not having available who that was. I'm curious to see if it was somebody of note. Let me take a look to see if we can look at the tracks here.
The backing vocals on that song is by the Coconuts.
Coconuts.
That's what they're, named.
Interesting.
Cheryl Poirier, Adriana Kagi, Taryn Hagee, and Jessica Felton. They were backing vocals on not only Surrender, but Like a Song and Red Light also.
Okay. Well, let's give a shout out to that. I wanted to make sure they got shouted out as well. So good stuff. But yeah, I think it's very interesting. As I have it up right now, because there's a couple of other thoughts I want to think, but you said, what was the reception to this? So it's kind of, let's go into some names that we know, right? Here's Rolling Stone says the album's musical strengths are largely the product of well-honed arrangements and carefully balanced dynamics, which
that's exactly what
I think is pretty fair. Carefully balanced dynamics is a good way to describe the interplay of the instruments. And I hope we kind of did a good enough job of explaining how everything fits in a little bit. I know I'd said kind of the bass in the background, you know, the drums and the guitar weaving around Bono's voice in the production. Is there anything else sonically that you would like to mention in that balance?
No, I just think Bono's voice probably doesn't get enough credit nowadays. Also, I think he works really well in the context of the song. He doesn't have his voice has a unique
well, it breaks on
power
tune,
to it,
which is hard, which is an incredible thing, right? Like you can get it push it to the point of breaking, but it stays on tune. It's hard to explain how difficult that is to do. Yeah.
It's just it's I mean, I guess his voice has an earnestness to it, but it works for me in the context of this album.
So Dave Marsh says, it did not match the pure chilling intensity of Boy, and that Lillywhite did not give the guitars enough prominence. However, he did say there's a passion and commitment and potent songs. Robert Christgau says, quote, the deadly European virus that's always tainted this band turns out to be their charismatic melodic device.
Okay.
So, and so that's a little rough. This is, I think, a little unfair, too, but he says, the Edge becomes a tuneful guitarist by the simple expedient of not soloing, and if Bono has too many Gregorian moments, his conviction still carries the music.
Okay.
It's a little rough right there. So let's look for one or two other ones. So NME made a parallel between Boy and War, and I know you said you haven't heard Boy yet, but I think it's very... there were a lot of times, I think, where people compared those two albums and tended to like Boy a little bit better. I think they kind of say it ran a little bit more hot. I don't know if I'd totally agree with that, to be quite honest. I think they're both very good albums. But yeah, there's also people that said it's their most consistent album yet, full of plaintive lyrics and fiery guitar work. And one thing they say is the lyrics are a little heavy-handed. You hear a couple times too, but
Yeah.
I mean, but that's to some degree that's part of U2's charm. They're not trying to be too clever. They are earnest, and I appreciate the earnestness. And I'll be interested now to hear what Matt has to say, because I would say that both you and I say that Matt's earnest. We at different times, right? So
Did Matt pick up on the lyrics? Let's see.
Of course he didn't pick up on the lyrics, but like it even sounds earnest though, I
Yes.
think. So what does Matt say?
Well, Matt said that New Year's Day is the best U2 song ever. So he really liked that.
I mean, it's a great song. I don't know if I'd go so far as say ever. Yeah.
All four parts of the album shine and stand out, or the songs shine and stand out on their own. The addition of the keys adds another layer, and the production solidifies it as an all-time classic for him. The rest of the album is full of energy, and Bono's vocals are awesome. And he also didn't really know this album before this week.
I remember he told me he's not super familiar with U2, both you guys. So that's why I was kind of curious about when we covered them, because I kind of, once again, it's kind of shocking to me that like REM, you guys like just U2 didn't really track for you guys, because I'm like, my God, they're a freaking huge band, like huge, to the point where like I felt I had to know them growing up, you know, like to understand, you know, what they were before I made a judgment on them. So
yeah, but from top to bottom, he really liked the album. Not a bad song on it, and a big thumbs up from him. So he liked it also.
It doesn't surprise me though, because like I said, I think it just became one of those things where it became trendy to kind of say, oh, you know, U2, you know, blah blah blah. But like they're a remarkable band, and maybe part of my, you know, while they're not one of my favorite bands in the world, they're a band that I consistently enjoy most of what they've recorded. Even if at times I can say, all right, well, that's a little, you know, it's a little much, or the persona or the show is a little grandiose. But, you know, you can't deny the fact that I've always thought the Edge is a very underrated guitar player. And yeah, like you said, as a front man, there's few frontmen with more charisma. And you know, what's really interesting about Bono is a lot of times when we describe charisma in a frontman, right, it's like in a male frontman, it's kind of couched in like sex appeal, right? And I'm not taking away from, you know, the merits of, you know, Bono's sex appeal to some, but his charisma doesn't really radiate from that domain, right?
Right.
It's he's can't take your eyes off him way, but not in sort of like a Mick Jagger, you know, type way, right? Where Jim Morrison, you know, Led Zeppelin, you know, type way. His is you're drawn to it by like a different type of charisma.
Yeah, that's a good point. Have you ever seen U2 live?
I have not, actually, believe it or not. They're one of the few bands that I would have liked to have seen live that I have never seen live. Interestingly enough, I'd probably put them in the top 3 on that list. And another band we're going to cover tonight, Iron Maiden, is another band that I actually have never seen live, believe it or not. So they would both be in my top 3 bands I never saw. Any band that I could have seen live, right? I, for the most part, have been able to say I've seen them. But U2, well, or some version of them, right?
Yes.
Not necessarily the one I wanted to see, but sometimes I saw it. But yeah, U2 would have been one that I would have liked to have seen. But did not have. Obviously, I don't think you have, right?
No. Yeah. I'm not a huge. You know, by the time I would have seen them, they would have been super huge, and I don't think I ever would have gone to like a big stadium arena show like that.
Okay, even for a band you loved.
Yeah, even for bands I love, I like the smaller venues.
Intimate.
Yeah. Yep.
You want to have Bono sing directly into your eyes with passion.
I want to be able to see them, you know, relatively close, I guess, ultimately.
That's fair. I can't say there's anything wrong with that. So,
All
but
right.
so that's a pretty strong thumbs up for me. How about your thoughts?
Same. Yeah, thumbs up.